The gray light of a Tuesday morning bled across the cobblestones of Millward Square, leaching the color from the awnings of the farmers' market stalls and the faces of the few people who drifted through them. At a small, wobbly wrought iron table outside the Daily Grind, Arthur Finch sat alone, as he did every Tuesday. He was a man made of quiet habits and faded things. His jacket, a relic of olive-drab canvas from a war most had forgotten, was thin at the elbows. His hands, gnarled with age, moved with a slow, practiced grace as he polished a small silver locket, rubbing away the day's tarnish with the worn cuff of his sleeve. The coffee in his cup was cold, but he didn't notice. His world had shrunk to the 2-inch circumference of this locket and the memories held within. He was a ghost at the feast of the living, a silent fixture the town had learned to look through. This invisibility was his shield. Today it would be his curse. The disruption arrived with the force of a flash flood, loud and synthetic. Jet Rider, an influencer known to his millions of followers as Jetstream, descended on the square with his cameraman, a lanky youth named Chad who held his phone like a weapon. Jet was a creature of calculated chaos, his hair an electric blue, his clothes a billboard of clashing luxury brands. He moved with the predatory confidence of a man who believed the world was his soundstage. His eyes scanned the square, dismissing families and young couples, searching for the perfect prop for his next viral video. He was hunting for weakness, for a story he could twist and sell. His gaze landed on Arthur. Perfect, old, frail, silent, an easy target. "And we are live, stream team," Jet announced to his phone, his voice a booming, artificial baritone. He swaggered toward Arthur's table, Chad orbiting him to capture the perfect angle. Today's social experiment is all about respect for our elders, or the lack thereof. He winked at the camera. "We're gonna see if this grandpa here still has some fight left in him, or if he's just another forgotten relic." The words were designed to provoke, to manufacture a conflict for his audience's consumption. He pulled a chair out from an adjacent table, scraping its metal legs against the stone with a screech that made Arthur flinch. Jet slammed the chair down next to him, the impact rattling Arthur's table and sloshing the last of the cold coffee over the rim of the cup. He leaned in close, his cologne a cloying chemical fog. "What's up, Pops? Lost in thought? Thinking about the good old days before the internet made guys like you obsolete?" The camera zoomed in on Arthur's weathered face, hungry for a flicker of anger, a tremor of fear. But Arthur just continued his polishing, his movements a fraction slower, his knuckles a little whiter. He did not look up. He simply retreated further into the fortress of his silence, a place Jet Rider and his noisy, hollow world could not possibly comprehend. Jet's manufactured smile tightened. This wasn't going according to plan. Silence was bad for engagement. He needed a reaction. He needed content. "Yo, Chad, you getting this? The guy's a statue," he barked, never breaking eye contact with his phone's lens. He turned his attention back to Arthur, his voice dripping with condescending sweetness. "Hey, Grandpa, you hear me? Earth to old-timer. Did you forget to take your pills today?" He snapped his fingers inches from Arthur's face. The sharp crack echoed in the quiet square. A few people at nearby tables looked over, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and morbid curiosity. They recognized Jet. They knew the formula, public humiliation packaged as entertainment. Some discreetly raised their own phones, ready to capture a supporting angle of the impending train wreck. They were participants now, silent accomplices in the digital coliseum. Arthur's hand paused its circular motion on the locket. He could feel the heat of Jet's proximity, the invasive stare of the camera lens. He smelled the cheap sugar in the young man's energy drink. But he refused to give him the satisfaction of a response. To engage would be to validate the intrusion, to accept the premise that his piece was something that could be bought or sold for clicks. He had stood his ground in places far more terrifying than this. He had faced down men whose eyes held real malice, not the performative cruelty of a child playing dress-up. So he remained still, a granite island in Jet's churning sea of noise. This infuriated Jet more than any shouted insult could have. His worth was measured in reactions, and this old man was giving him nothing. "Okay, you want to play it that way?" Jet sneered, his voice losing its playful edge and taking on a genuine nastiness. He reached across the table and deliberately knocked over Arthur's coffee cup. The dark, cold liquid spread across the tabletop, pooling and dripping onto the worn toes of Arthur's boots. "Oops. Clumsy me," he laughed. A harsh, grating sound. "Look at that. Now you got nothing to do but talk to me." He leaned forward, his face a grotesque mask of feigned concern. "You all right there, champ? You seem a little slow. Maybe you need a nap." The crowd of onlookers grew. A mother pulled her child a little closer. A pair of teenagers giggled, whispering Jet's channel name to each other. But no one moved to intervene. They were paralyzed by the modern bystander effect, a strange mix of social anxiety and the ingrained habit of watching life unfold through a screen. To step in would be to become part of the show, and that was a role no one wanted. The systemic indifference was a wall, thick and soundproof, isolating Arthur in the center of the spectacle. He was utterly, publicly alone. The world outside the wobbly iron table began to dissolve. The influencers' taunts, the scent of spilled coffee, the silent judgment of the crowd. It all faded into a low hum, a background noise to the roaring symphony in his mind. For Arthur, the square was no longer Millward Square. The cobblestones under his feet softened into the thick, sucking mud of a rice paddy somewhere east of Danong. The crisp autumn air grew heavy, thick with the humidity of the jungle and the metallic tang of blood and cordite. Jet's bleached blue hair was replaced by the terrified, sweat-streaked face of a boy from Ohio, no older than 19, who was calling for his mother as the world came apart around them. The sharp snap of Jet's fingers became the crack of enemy fire whipping past his ear. Arthur's hand, the one holding the locket, tightened. This small piece of silver was his anchor, the one solid thing in a life haunted by ghosts. He remembered the day Eleanor had given it to him just before his second tour. Her hands, warm and soft, had closed over his. "So you don't forget the way home," she had whispered, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. Inside was a tiny, perfectly rendered photograph of her smiling, her head tilted just so. For 37 months of chaos, that smile had been his compass. It had guided him through ambushes in the dead of night, through the deafening thunder of a Huey's rotor blades, through the agonizing duty of carrying a friend's lifeless body back to the LZ. When he finally did come home, he was a different man, a vessel of quiet sorrows. But Eleanor had understood. She never pushed him to talk about the things he'd seen. She simply held his hand, her presence a silent promise that he was safe, that the war was over. Her own war, with the cancer that took her 5 years ago, had been fought with that same quiet dignity. On her last day, she had made him promise. "Don't let them make you hard, Artie," she'd said, her voice a fragile wisp. "Don't let the bitterness win. Just live. Quietly. For me." And so he had. He kept to himself. He tended his small garden. He came to this cafe every Tuesday, the day they had met, and polished her locket. He endured the loneliness, the invisibility, the casual disregard of a world that had moved on. He endured it all because he had made a promise. The jacket he wore was not his own. It had belonged to Corporal Danny Deacon Miller, the boy from Ohio. Deacon had taken a piece of shrapnel meant for Arthur. As he lay dying, he had made Arthur promise to take his jacket. "It's my lucky one," he'd rasped. "Maybe it'll be luckier for you." Arthur wore it not for luck, but for remembrance. It was a shroud of honor, a testament to a debt that could never be repaid. This silly, preening boy in front of him knew nothing of promises, of debt, of honor. He was just noise, and Arthur had learned long ago how to tune out the noise. Jet's frustration was reaching its peak. His livestream chat was filling with emojis of sleeping faces and spiders weaving webs. His audience was getting bored. He needed a climax. His eyes darted around, landing on the one thing the old man seemed to care about, the silver locket clutched in his hand. A cruel, triumphant smile spread across Jet's face. This was it. This would break him. With a theatrical flourish, He lunged across the table and snatched the locket from Arthur's grasp. The chain snapped, a faint, pathetic sound. "What we got here, Grandpa?" Jet crowed, holding the locket up for the camera. "The secret to your long, boring life? The deed to your mansion?" For the first time, Arthur's composure shattered. The carefully constructed walls of his stoicism crumbled into dust. It wasn't anger that flooded his features, but a raw, desperate panic. The ghosts of the jungle receded, replaced by the fresh, gut-wrenching terror of losing the last piece of Eleanor he had left. "Please," he said. The word was a dry, cracking sound, torn from a place deep inside him. It was the first word he had spoken, and it was a plea. "Please, give that back." This was the reaction Jet had been waiting for. The desperation in the old man's eyes was ratings gold. He could feel the engagement numbers ticking up. "Oh, so he does speak," Jet taunted, his voice dripping with mock surprise. He dangled the locket over the puddle of cold coffee on the table. "You want it back? You gotta earn it. Tell the stream team why it's so important. Is it your war medal? Did you get it for being the best at peeling potatoes?" The crowd, which had grown larger and pressed in closer, let out a collective, nervous gasp. The spectacle had crossed a line from pathetic to profane. Yet still, they watched, their phones held high, a silent, digital chorus to Jet's cruelty. The pressure in the square became a physical thing, a suffocating weight pressing down on Arthur's frail shoulders. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of old bones. Jet, reveling in his power, flicked the locket open with his thumb. The tiny, smiling face of a young woman looked up at him. "Ah, look at this," he jeered, turning the open locket toward his phone. "Is this your little girlfriend from the nursing home? Did you steal her from another old geezer?" The insult, so casual and vile, landed with the force of a physical blow. Arthur rose slowly from his chair, his body moving with the creaking stiffness of old age and older wounds. Every eye in the square was on him. A hush fell. This was the moment of confrontation everyone had been waiting for. But when Arthur spoke, his voice was not filled with rage. It was imbued with a sorrow so deep it seemed to absorb all the sound around it. "That is my wife," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Her name was Eleanor. She is gone. Please, son, just give her back to me." The word son hung in the air, a quiet appeal to a humanity Jet did not possess. For the influencer, this was the perfect climax. The broken old man, begging for his trinket. He looked directly into his phone's camera, a glint of triumph in his eyes. "You heard him, stream team. He wants his wifey back." He turned to Arthur, his face a caricature of malice. "You want it? Earn it," and then he did it. With a swift, arrogant motion, he slapped Arthur across the face. The sound was shockingly loud in the silent square, a flat, wet crack that seemed to reverberate off the brick buildings. It was not a hard slap, but it was brutally intimate, a violation of dignity that was far more violent than a simple punch. Arthur stumbled backward a step, his hand flying to his cheek, not to soothe the sting but as an involuntary gesture of shock. The crowd gasped. Phones wavered. The cheap entertainment had suddenly become horrifyingly real. But Arthur did not fall. He did not cry out. He simply absorbed the blow, his frail body swaying for a moment before he regained his footing. He straightened his shoulders, pulling the worn fabric of Deacon Miller's jacket taut. He lowered his hand and looked Jet Rider directly in the eye. And in Arthur's gaze, there was no fear, no hatred. There was only a vast, bottomless pity. It was the look of a man who had witnessed the very worst of human nature and had found this little performance to be nothing more than a pathetic footnote. In that moment of quiet endurance, in his refusal to be broken, Arthur Finch won. He just didn't know it yet. The slap echoed in the sudden, profound silence. The giddy, vicarious thrill that had held the crowd captive evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping shame. The air, once charged with anticipation, was now thick with collective guilt. It was no longer a show. It was an assault on a defenseless old man. A woman in a floral dress, who had been filming with a slight smile, slowly lowered her phone. Her face was pale. "That's Mr. Finch?" she whispered to the man beside her, her voice barely audible. "He lives on Elm Street, tends the community garden. He gives my kids tomatoes every summer." The man nodded, his own expression grim. The anonymous old man was crystallizing into a person, a neighbor. The narrative Jet had so carefully constructed was beginning to fracture. Across the square, a young barista named Leo stood in the doorway of the Daily Grind, wiping down a portafilter with a rag. He had been watching the whole thing, his stomach twisting with a helpless anger. His eyes were fixed on the small, tarnished pin on the collar of Arthur's jacket. It was a simple design, a screaming eagle. He'd seen it before, in a dusty box in his parents' attic, pinned to his grandfather's dress uniform. His grandfather had never talked about the war, but Leo knew the insignia. 101st Airborne Division. On a desperate hunch, he pulled out his own phone, not to record, but to search. His fingers flew across the screen, typing local heroes 101st Airborne Millward. The whispers began to ripple through the crowd, a low murmur of discontent. "Did you see his face? He didn't even flinch." That Jet guy is a monster. Jet, however, was oblivious. He was high on his own transgression, preening for his camera. He picked the locket up off the ground where it had fallen, holding it like a trophy. "And that's how you handle a disrespectful boomer? Stream team," he crowed, completely misreading the room. The tide had turned, but he was too busy admiring his own reflection in the waves to notice he was about to be dragged under. He was a king presiding over a kingdom of ghosts, celebrating a victory that had already cost him everything. Then came the sound. It started as a low, almost imperceptible vibration in the cobblestones, a tremor you felt in the soles of your feet before you heard it with your ears. It grew steadily, a deep, guttural rumble that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't thunder. It was something more primal, more mechanical. Heads turned from the pathetic drama in the square and looked toward the end of Main Street. The rumble swelled into a deafening roar, the synchronized thunder of V-twin engines. A wave of polished chrome and black leather crested the hill and began to pour into the town. It wasn't one or two motorcycles. It was a legion, an endless column riding 2 by 2 in perfect, intimidating formation. The sun glinted off handlebars and exhaust pipes, creating a blinding river of steel. On their backs were the iconic three-piece patches, the grinning death's head that needed no introduction. The Hell's Angels. They didn't just pass through. They owned the street, their presence consuming all the air and sound. They flowed into the square, peeling off with disciplined precision, surrounding the entire perimeter. 100, then 150, then 200 bikes formed a chrome and steel ring, sealing it off from the outside world. The engines cut out in a staggered, rolling wave that ended in a sudden, echoing silence. The only sound was the nervous breathing of the onlookers and the ticking of hot metal cooling. Doors of shops closed quietly. People backed away from the windows. Jet and Chad froze, their faces ashen. The bikers dismounted as one, the thud of 200 pairs of heavy boots hitting the pavement like a single, ominous drumbeat. At their head was a man built like a mountain, his beard a cascade of gray and black, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder fights. The president patch was stitched over his heart. He swung his leg over his bike and stood, his gaze sweeping over the scene. He didn't look at the terrified influencer. He didn't look at the gawking crowd. His eyes, sharp and clear, found the small, frail figure of Arthur Finch and locked onto him. The Brotherhood had arrived. The president, a man the patch on his vest named Sarge, moved with a deliberate, unhurried gait. The crowd parted for him instinctively, a sea of whispers and fearful glances. He walked through the space jet had created, his boots silent on the stone, and stopped directly in front of Arthur. He was a giant of a man, and Arthur had to crane his neck to look up at him. Sarge didn't speak. His eyes scanned Arthur's face, taking in the faint red mark on his cheek, the weary set of his jaw. Then, His gaze dropped to the tarnished screaming eagle pin on Arthur's collar. A flicker of recognition, of something profound and sorrowful, passed through his eyes. He stood there for a long moment, a silent sentinel, before turning to face his men. He raised his hand, and in a voice that was a low, gravelly boom, a voice accustomed to being heard over the roar of engines and the din of bars, he spoke. "This man," he began, his words carrying across the dead-silent square, "is Arthur Finch." Jet Rider flinched at the sound of the name being spoken with such reverence. He was a crew chief and a door gunner with the 101st Airborne. In the spring of '68, outside of Hugh City, his Huey went down. Under heavy fire, he pulled 3 wounded men from the wreckage. My father was one of them. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. My old man took 3 rounds to the chest that day, Sarge continued, his voice thick with emotion. Rounds that were meant for Arthur. My dad died in a hospital bed 20 years later, surrounded by his family. But he got those 20 years. He got to meet his grandkids. He got those years because Arthur Finch refused to leave a man behind. As Sarge spoke, Leo, the young barista, finally found what he was looking for on his phone. His eyes widened in disbelief. He shoved the screen toward the woman next to him. It was an old, digitized newspaper article with a grainy photo. The headline read, "Local Soldier Awarded Distinguished Service Cross for Valor." The article detailed Sergeant Arthur Finch's heroism. His repeated trips back into a burning helicopter under enemy fire to rescue his crew. It spoke of his humility, of how he shunned the attention upon his return, wanting only to live a quiet life. The woman read it, then showed the person next to her. The phone was passed from hand to hand, the story spreading through the crowd faster than a wildfire. The quiet, invisible old man was a hero, a real hero, and they had stood by and watched as a child with a camera had tried to break him. The shame was now a palpable, living thing, a poison in the air. The truth had been revealed, and it was a devastating indictment of them all. Jet Rider stood frozen, his face a canvas of pure terror. The cocky influencer persona had disintegrated, leaving behind a pale, trembling boy who understood, far too late, that he had trespassed on sacred ground. The phone in Chad's hand, the source of all his power, now felt like a block of lead. The digital world he commanded was useless here. This was a world of leather, steel, and a code of honor he couldn't begin to comprehend. Sarge turned his gaze from Arthur to the locket still clutched in Jet's hand. He took 2 slow steps forward, and Jet flinched back as if he'd been struck. Without a word, Sarge plucked the locket from his limp fingers. He held it gently in his own calloused palm, then used the sleeve of his leather vest to carefully wipe away the grime. He walked back to Arthur and pressed it into his hand, closing the old man's fingers around it. "Sorry we're late, Artie," Sarge said, his booming voice now soft and gentle. "Dad always told us if we ever found you, we were to look out for you. Said we owed you a debt." Arthur looked down at the locket, then up at the giant standing before him. He simply nodded, his throat too tight with emotion to speak. One by one, other bikers began to move forward. They formed a slow, reverent line. They were men of few words, their faces hard, their hands scarred. But as they passed Arthur, their expressions softened. One reached out and gently squeezed his shoulder. Another gave a crisp, short nod of respect. A younger member, barely in his 20s, unzipped his own pristine vest, his cut, the symbol of his identity and belonging in the club, and with a gesture of profound deference, he draped it over Arthur's thin shoulders. The heavy leather settled around him like a suit of armor, the grinning skull on the back now a declaration of protection. The community, shamed into action, began its own penance. The owner of the Daily Grind hurried out with a steaming mug of fresh coffee and a warm pastry, placing them on the table. "On the house, Mr. Finch?" he mumbled, unable to meet his eyes. For life, the woman who had first recognized him started to clap. It was a slow, hesitant sound at first, but it was joined by another, and then another, until the entire square was filled with a roaring ovation. It wasn't applause for a performance. It was an apology. Jet and Chad were trapped, a wall of silent, imposing bikers forming a tight circle around them. Sarge turned his attention to them, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "You put your hands on him," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, which was somehow more terrifying than shouting. "You disrespected an elder." A warrior, he pointed a thick finger at Jet's phone. "You live by that thing. You're gonna die by it. You're going to delete every second of footage of him. Then you're gonna start a new live stream, and you are going to apologize. To him. And to every veteran you and your generation have forgotten." Jet's face crumpled. "Please. I didn't know," he stammered. "You don't have to know," Sarge growled. "You just have to have respect. Something you know nothing about. Go live." Now, trembling so hard he could barely hold his phone steady, Jet fumbled with the screen. A new live stream began, broadcasting his terrified, tear-streaked face to his millions of followers. With the Hell's Angels standing behind him as a silent, menacing jury, he delivered the most sincere and humiliating apology of his life. His career was over. He had built his brand on manufactured authenticity, and he had just been exposed as the ultimate fake in the most real way imaginable. When the pathetic confession was over, Sarge leaned in close. "Get out of this town," he whispered, "and if I ever see your face again, online or in person, I'll give you something real to cry about." Jet and Chad scrambled away, tripping over their own feet in their haste to escape. They disappeared down a side street, two ghosts banished from the world of the living. The tension in the square finally broke. The bikers began to move back toward their machines, the sense of imminent violence receding. Arthur sat at his table, the heavy leather vest a warm, comforting weight on his shoulders. The locket was safe in his palm. He looked at the faces of the people around him. They were no longer the blank, indifferent stares of strangers. He saw shame, yes, but he also saw respect. He saw connection. He was no longer invisible. Sarge stopped by his table one last time before mounting his bike. "You need anything, Artie?" he said, his voice a solemn vow. "Anything at all. You send word." Arthur looked up at him, at all of them, this fearsome brotherhood that had materialized from the ghosts of his past to stand guard over his present. "Thank you," he managed to say, the words thick in his throat. Sarge simply nodded. "No, thank you." Then came the thunder. 200 engines roared to life in a deafening, magnificent chorus. It was not a sound of aggression, but a salute, a biker's honor guard. They pulled out of the square in the same disciplined formation they had arrived in, a river of steel and loyalty flowing back out of town. As the last engine roar faded into the distance, a profound quiet settled over Millward Square. Arthur sat alone at his table, surrounded by his neighbors, who kept a respectful distance. He was still a man of quiet habits and faded things, but he was no longer a ghost. He was Arthur Finch. He slowly opened the locket. Eleanor's smile looked up at him, as bright and beautiful as the day he first saw it. A single tear, the first he had shed in years, traced a clean path through the dust and grime on his weathered cheek. It was not a tear of sadness or of pain. It was a tear of peace. He was finally home.